Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at how to make an animated circular meter. And a couple examples of where you would see this would be, say, PUBG or Fortnite, when you're trying to revive a fallen team member, that when you begin the process, a gauge appears on your screen. It's circular, and it starts to fill from the top and fills in a clockwise direction until it's completely full. So that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. So let's get right into it. Down here, you'll see there are two images. You can use whatever program you want. I drew them in Anime Studio. And basically, it's the same image twice. This is meant to be the background meter that's empty. And this is the overlay that is going to be filled up over time. I also made the fill on this one translucent. You certainly don't have to. And that is accomplished in the external program. So whatever application you're using to draw the image, that's where you can establish that translucence. You can also do it in Unity, but that's really separate. And it really doesn't affect this. It's more just a visual benefit, so that way when you're reviving the team member, it's not totally blocking what's behind it. Okay, so what are we going to do? The key to making this work is you have to use UI elements. So even though these are 2D images, you're not going to use the sprite object or the sprite component. You're going to use a UI object. So you're going to come up here to Game Object. You're going to go to UI. Again, has to be UI for this to work. And you're going to click on Image. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to copy that image. You can either do the same process again or just copy. Get you to the same place. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that when you use a UI object, it creates something that's known as a canvas. And for some reason, the canvas is on its own scaling system. So here's your work area. And if you double click on the canvas, you can see the canvas is way out here and your work area is down there. Don't worry, this will properly overlay when you're playing the game. I have no idea why Unity makes the workspace look like this. And I want to take a moment to say that even though I'm doing this in a 2D environment, this will work in a 3D environment as well, because the UI works the same way. Okay, so here's our image over here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to rename these. So I'm just going to click on it twice, and we'll call this one Outline. And then click on this one twice. Oops, a little bit too fast. And we'll call this one Fill. And as I've mentioned in my other videos, the naming, for the most part, means nothing to Unity. So Unity doesn't realize this is an outline. Unity doesn't realize this is a fill. Those namings are for your benefit. So now we need to transfer these images over to our image objects. So for the outline, we just drag and put that right where it says source image. You can't see it yet because it's behind the other image. We'll go to fill, and likewise we'll drag that one to source image. And you really still can't see it because this is still on top of it. Like I said, it's the same image, just with a different fill. Now we're just going to quickly run this. And actually, it wasn't in the right place. Let's go back to Canvas. Oh, I'm sorry. It's way out here. So like I said, it has to be within the Canvas area. And so that should be dead center-ish. Yep. It's up a little bit. You can just move that down if you want. Okay. So now we have our two images. What we need to do is we need this image, the fill, to be set up as a fill. So with that selected, if you come over here to the inspector and you'll see image type, it defaults to simple. If you click on this, see how it does filled? You can do that. And then the only one we're going to care about, well, there's actually a couple settings we care about. So fill method will be radio 360, and fill origin, we're going to start at the top. But as you can see, you can start bottom, right, top, or left. So we're going to start at the top simply because that's typically how games like that work. So let's zoom in a bit. And this should give you a good sense of how we're going to do this. So if we take the fill amount, we slide this over. So what's going to happen is we're going to start with the fill being at 0. And then over time, we'll have the fill increase. I say over time, it's going to be whatever, 4, 5, 6 seconds. It all depends what you're trying to do. Like sometimes you get a gauge like this when you're consuming an object, so the timer might be shorter. But that's what we're going to do is over time, we're going to have this value change between 0 and 1. Okay, so now what we're going to do is now that that's in place, the bulk of what's left is really just coding, and that is we're going to attach a script that's going to change that. So now we're going to right-click, create C# script, and we'll call this counter. Actually, let's call it meter, since it's a meter. We'll call it meter con for control. And what we're going to do is when you have a bunch of different things that have to happen in a synchronized manner, typically you may not have the script actually attached to the object that's being affected. You may have a GM object, a game master object, that reaches out and controls those. That way you have this GM object handling all these functions in a synchronized and coordinated manner. So we're not actually going to attach the script to our meters. We're going to have a GM object. And just to be clear, GM, just as I mentioned, like with outline and fill, GM means absolutely nothing to Unity. It's just a reminder to you, the designer, that this object it's a placeholder object. It's being used to basically put all these codes and functions together. So let's go ahead and go to game object 3D. Just create empty. That's fine. We'll call it GM, and its position for the most part doesn't matter. Unless you actually have things spawning out of the GM position, for the most part, its position does not matter. And let's go back to main camera. And what we're going to do now is for that GM object, we're going to, and we really didn't have to go to main camera for this, just changing the view. We're going to take that script and attach it to the GM object. Now let's go ahead and open up that script. So we open that up. And now what we do, we're just going to get rid of the two remark statements. This just reminds us that start gets used at initialization and that update occurs once per frame. So what we need to do is we need to let Unity know that we're going to use some UI commands. So using Unity engine.ui. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do public image. See, image wouldn't be there if I hadn't chosen UI. Public image, and we'll call it circle meter. Semicolon at the end and save. Now we go back to our GM object, which the script is attached to, and there we go, circle meter. So what we're going to do is we're just going to have, suppose we could make the fill a child to the outline. And then, let's just do the fill. We'll just drag and drop the fill here. And as I've mentioned in my other videos, that this is meant to be, I'm not saying that this is the best way or the only way. This is a way, and just to get you started. Okay, so now that that object has been associated with this, we can now make changes to it. And specifically, we said that we need to change, we come here, we need to change this, the fill amount. So it's the image and then the fill amount. So let's now make a change to the circle meter. And again, this is just for demonstrative purposes. We're actually going to move this and make some changes, but I just want to show you how we're going to access that attribute. So we're trying to change circle meter. We want to change one component. Well, which component do we want to change? We said it's the image component. Okay. So what part of the image component? Well, we said we wanted to change fill, and there's fill amount. I'm going to set that to 0.5f. And again, this isn't what we're going to do in the final. This is just demonstrating that this is how you go about changing the fill. So let's save it. Let's run it. And as you can see, it is only half filled. So what we're going to do is now where we currently have the constant 0.5, we're going to replace that with a variable. So if the variable increases over time, then this will fill over time. But like I said, we're not going to have it here in the start section. So what we're going to do is let's use IE numerator because this is built for timers, and we'll call this fill control and then parentheses, brackets. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this and cut it from here and put it here. And again, that's still not the final form of it. We're just organizing how we're going to do this. Now, in iEnumerator, you need to set a timer, which is absolutely perfect for what we want because we want this to be changed over time, and we don't want it to be dependent upon frame rate. So if we're changing it in the update section, well, that means it'd be updated per frame, and we don't want to do that because that means if you have a faster frame rate, the circle would close faster, when in fact you want it to be independent of frame rate. You want it to be, to complete over a given fixed amount of time. So yield, return, new. Oops, sorry, dropped me down a line. My apologies for any confusion. Yield, return, new. Now, I generally like to explain what each part does. In this case, I'm not. You do have to put yield, return, new, but it's really the next phrase that matters, okay? It is wait 4 seconds. This is really what you're trying to do with this line. You want to cause a delay. So let's make it like 0.05f. And it's just a coincidence that was 0.5 and that's 0.05. I just wanted to make sure the change was really obvious. So again, don't worry too much about this. Yes, you have to type it. Just know that what happens is this sentence, this line, is going to cause 0.05 seconds to pass before anything after it occurs. Okay, so what we want is we want this to be a variable, not a constant. So public, it has to be a float since we're using decimals. So public float, and it's going to be, let's call this total fill. You have to be really careful about reusing protected words. So we're just going to call this total fill, and it will start off as 0. So we now get rid of this and replace it with total fill. So what happens is when this gets called, 5/100ths of a second will pass, and then this will get applied to the fill amount, which means that we need this to keep changing. So total fill plus equals 0.05. So what this is saying, oops, sorry, need an F in there. So what this is saying is total fill, whatever it's currently equal to, add 0.05 to it. And again, you just have to put in an F because it's a decimal. So again, 0.05 is weighted. We change this by 0.05. And again, it's just a coincidence because you don't want the fill to change by too much because it won't be a smooth animation. You want it to be a smooth animation. We might find that this is too slow. We'll see. So it waits 5/100th of a second. This gets increased to 0.05. In fact, I think that might actually be too high. But anyways, we'll continue. This gets increased. That new amount is applied to the fill. And then what do we want to happen to that? Well, we want this to be recursive. We want it to keep occurring over and over again. So right in here, we can do start coroutine. And we're going to do fill control and parentheses. Now, this does not execute on its own. It has to be told to, and there's nothing here telling it to. So what we'll do is for now, we'll put it in the start section. Ultimately, we want a key press to do it, but I don't want to do too much at once. I want to make sure that this is working properly before we trigger it with a key press. And that's always a good idea, is that you don't want to try to launch the full version of a functionality. You want to test parts of it first before you start making it more complex. So this script is attached to the GM object. So when the GM object is instantiated, this happens. So as soon as the scene starts, this happens, and it says, go do fill control. Fill control waits 5/100ths of a second, increases this variable, it's applied to the fill amount, rinse and repeat. Because this says to do this all over again. So we'll save that. And we'll run it. Just like that. And it worked. It wasn't great smooth animation. And also, by the way, this is still running over and over again. We probably would want it to stop once it hits 100%, and then you have like the gauge disappear, destroyed, whatever. So that was actually too much. And what you might do, this is a little bit like crafting. As you change this one, you might have to change this one as too. So for instance, if you reduce the amount that's changed, you might also need to reduce the delay, because inherently it's going to fill slower because you're increasing the fill by a smaller amount. So you might need to have it delay less. But we'll keep it like this for the moment. We'll run it again. That's smoother. Still not really great though, so let's change that to 0.03, and we'll change this to 0.15. Why didn't I just change it to 0.01? Because the change from 0.02 to 0.01, you've cut the amount in half. So even though it's a very small number, you've still reduced it by half. So this way it's only reduced by a quarter. Okay, that's actually just about right. I'd say that was pretty good. Now, the only thing to keep in mind, though, the other thing is that if this is meant to occur over a certain amount of time, then you will have to tweak these so as that it comes out to that amount of time. So I'm sitting here saying, well, you know, you're going to have to change this to make this smoother, but ultimately this is really going to, the calculation between the two, you want this to happen over a certain amount of time. So right now it looks like it would take roughly 70 iterations to hit 100%. So if it takes 70, then that means this is taking like just over 2 seconds, like 2.1 seconds. You may determine, okay, that's too fast, that's too slow. So in your quest to make this animate smooth, also keep in mind that the combination of these will determine how long it takes, and that's usually a set amount that is really the number you're trying to reach. So it takes 2 seconds to res them, or 5 seconds to drink the potion, or whatever. And then last thing is that this would be triggered with, say, a key press. To make it simple, let's just use the space bar. So first of all, we don't want this to happen in the start, because this happens as soon as the object is instantiated, as soon as it's spawned, initialized. So instead, we'll do this in the update section, and we'll say if input. So obviously, we're looking for input. So if input dot, let's do get key down, and I believe we can just put this into parentheses and do the word space for the space bar, and then this. Now, if you're doing an if statement, if there's only one line after it, you don't have to put in brackets. But if you're going to have multiple lines, then you need to surround this with squiggly brackets. In other words, you would need to do that. Again, you don't have to when it's only one line, but there have been times where I've tested, made just one line, great, it's good. I add a second line, and because I want something else to happen, and I forget, I did not add those, and suddenly it breaks it. So probably good practice to always add those just to be safe. And one last thing that we have to do now before we run it, because this was technically not working correctly. It's just that it was happening so fast, it was basically imperceptible. And that is, since we never set the default fill to 0 when the meter was being created, it was technically full for 3/100ths of a second, and then it got reduced. So it was technically not right along, just it was imperceptible because it was so fast. So if we go back to the fill object, see how it says 1? Just bring that all the way down to 0, and then that should do it. We run this, so it's not filled. Hit the space, it fills, and I think that's about it. So if there's anything else you'd like to see, just leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you'd like to see, and I hope this has been helpful to you.